thinking, ugh, Shakespeare, so boring, can't understand the language, every character ends up dead, what even is this? Yeah, no, we're gonna, yes, the language is very antiquated, and yes, the tragedies do usually end with pretty much every character dying at some point, but there's a lot more to Shakespeare than that, and I want to get into what else I see in it beyond that, because that does sound pretty unpleasant and dismal and difficult, right? However, I have now read more than 2/3 of Shakespeare's plays, and one thing that I can tell you is that there is a lot of variety. Regardless of what types of stories you like to read about, there's probably a Shakespeare play for that. In fact, I made a whole video about what Shakespeare plays you should read based on your favorite modern genres. I love that there's so much variety, whether you're in the mood for a tragedy, for a romantic comedy, for something based on real historical events, usually very loosely based on, but still. There is a Shakespeare play for that. Most people read Romeo and Juliet in school, as well as possibly Hamlet, Julius Caesar, or A Midsummer Night's Dream. I think those are pretty common ones to be taught in school, maybe others as well. I read Othello in school, actually. In any case, what I'm getting at is that you only get a tiny sliver of what's actually out there because Shakespeare wrote over 30 plays. And the difference between something like King Lear, which is dysfunctional families and political manipulations and warfare and death and all kinds of stuff like that, versus something like A Midsummer Night's Dream, which is, a lighthearted fantasy adventure romance kind of story. It's just, they're wildly different. So if you think that you don't like Shakespeare, it might just be that you don't like what Shakespeare you've been exposed to so far. And I definitely recommend looking at what else there is before you write off Shakespeare as just not being your cup of tea. So I guess that's number 1 out of my top 5 reasons I like reading Shakespeare, because there's such a huge variety to choose from. There's a play for whatever mood you're in or whatever kind of story you want to read. Number 2 is because they are usually very character-driven. Shakespeare was very interested in exploring the inner motivations and thoughts and emotions of his characters. He didn't just write events that happened. And I feel like a lot of older literature does tend that way. It often tends more towards telling what happened as opposed to showing how the characters feel, why they do what they do, and so on and so forth. Now, that's not, completely universal. But Shakespeare goes way further than a lot of other classic literature in really showing you what's going on within the characters' hearts and minds and souls. If you read To Be or Not to Be from Hamlet, you see everything that Hamlet is going through, his entire thought process, his internal conflict. It's all just laid out there in front of you. I think because Shakespeare wrote plays and gave characters these long monologues where they go into all of that, more so than, in modern movies or TV shows, you don't really expect characters to just spill all of their feelings like that. But in Shakespeare's time, that was something that happened in plays. So I think that gives a lot of insight into the characters, and therefore they end up being often very deep and complex. And I like that. I like complex, interesting characters. I find it hard to get engaged in a story that doesn't have any. Number 3 is the beautiful language. Shakespeare's language is, I will admit, very difficult to get acclimated to. But as you read more of it, you start to pick it up a little bit. Now that doesn't mean, I've read more than 20 plays by Shakespeare, and I still use, the footnotes and the endnotes, and sometimes Googling it to see what on earth does that even mean. Because there's also, obviously words that you haven't encountered before, but then also historical context and all kinds of good stuff. But it does get easier over time to understand the language, and the language often is very beautiful. The way that Shakespeare chose to express things, it's like he didn't just have the characters say them, he did it so poetically. And I just find that to be just beautiful. What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. So Romeo would, were he not Romeo called, retain that dear perfection which he owes without that title. Romeo, doff thy name, and for that name which is no part of thee, take all myself. Juliet is basically saying, names aren't important. In the context of what she's saying, family names like Montague and Capulet aren't really important. It's who you are that's important. she's in love with Romeo despite the fact that he is a Montague, and so she would like it if he would just discard that name and they could be together without having to worry about their feuding families. She doesn't come out and say that, but it's very much implied in what she's saying, and all of the stuff about, contemplating what's in a name that which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. I don't know, there's something about the way that it's expressed. The word choice, the poetry of it. I love the language in Shakespeare. Number 4 is that Shakespeare's work is hugely influential on modern literature and modern culture. I can't tell you how many times, especially reading the really well-known, well-respected tragedies like Hamlet or Macbeth or Julius Caesar, I ended up thinking, oh, I know that line or that plot point or whatever, but I didn't know that was from Shakespeare. It's something that, because it is so old and so popular and has been revisited so many times over time by scholars, by writers, by movie makers, and so on and so forth, it's become a part of our culture whether we read the plays or not. So, might as well read the plays, right? At least that's my perspective on it. And then number 5 is closely related to them being influential, but also I would say they're timeless. The stories that are told take place at a particular point in history. They usually reflect more about Shakespeare's time than the historical time periods in which they actually take place. Like, take A Midsummer Night's Dream, for instance. Theoretically, it takes place in ancient Athens, but it really has nothing to do with ancient Athens. For all intents and purposes, it takes place in Shakespeare's time. But regardless of whether they take place in the ancient world, in the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance, whatever, they draw on concepts and themes that are just very universally relevant and are not restricted to either the setting or the time period in which they were written. And as a result, actually, Shakespeare is often performed in modern costuming. I don't know if you've seen any modern dress performances of Shakespeare plays, or like movie versions that have everybody wearing modern day clothes. Sometimes it's really easy to make them make sense in the modern day. Or like, I once went to see a community college performance of Romeo and Juliet, and they did something really clever with it, which was they had all the characters basically dressed in modern day clothes but fighting with swords and of course using the dialogue from the play, and it just felt like it was completely taken out of time. Like, you have aspects of the Middle Ages and aspects of the modern day all kind of jumbled together on stage, and you would think that it would be a mess, but it was actually, I think, my favorite performance of Romeo and Juliet that I've ever seen, and I've seen several. I think that something like that, or just performing Shakespeare in modern costuming in general, only works because the themes are so just universally resonant, and even if the context has changed a little bit, obviously, there are some that are very much a product of their time and would be very uncomfortable to even think about as anything other than a historical artifact. Like, I'm thinking The Taming of the Shrew or The Merchant of Venice, for instance. But something like Romeo and Juliet, I mean, teenagers whose families don't approve of their romance, that's just, that hasn't gone away. And neither have stories about revenge or jealousy or corruption or power and greed. Those are all, just things that are part of our world, and Shakespeare explores them beautifully and in a lot of depth. Same thing with the comedies, though. Even though the comedies are very silly and goofy and lighthearted, there's something about them that usually touches on something more serious. And I'm not even just talking about the tragicomedies like The Tempest, but like, for instance, Twelfth Night is about a woman who's shipwrecked in a foreign country. And yes, it's about her hilarious misadventures as she disguises herself as a boy and works in Duke Orsino's court and all of the stuff that happens there. But it's also about a girl who's lost her family and the life that she knew and is trying to navigate her way in a foreign country. And that, also is not limited to just the time period where it's set or when it was written. So I think that aspect of timelessness and universal relevance is one of the things that I really appreciate about a lot of Shakespeare's work. Alright, I hope that you enjoyed this video and that it has helped you to understand a little bit better what I love so much about Shakespeare, and maybe to find something about it that could appeal to you as well. If you liked this and you would like to see more from me, feel free to subscribe. I post new videos every Monday and Thursday.